Is she bigger than Sabalenka? Is she bigger than Coco? Is she
Yes.
the big?
There is a moment in sports when something shifts, when the crowds start arriving before the trophies do, when the fans recognize greatness before the rankings confirm it, when a name that nobody knew suddenly becomes the name that everybody is talking about. That moment has arrived in women's tennis, and the name at the center of it is Alex Eala. She's 20 years old, she is from the Philippines, and in the span of just 18 months, she has turned an entire sport upside down. If you want to follow this story as it unfolds in real time, hit subscribe right now, because what is happening with Alex Eala is the kind of thing that only comes around once in a generation, and you do not want to miss a single chapter of it. Steve Johnson spent 12 years competing on the ATP Tour. He shared locker rooms with champions. He watched stars rise and fall across more than a decade at the highest level of professional tennis. He knows the difference between a player who generates buzz and a player who genuinely moves the needle. So when Steve Johnson went on the Nothing Major podcast and called Alex Eala the biggest draw in women's tennis right now, the entire tennis world stopped and paid attention. He did not say she had potential. He did not say she was one to watch in the future. He said she already was the biggest draw, present tense, right now, today. He called her an absolute rock star, and he said she was drawing bigger crowds than Aryna Sabalenka, bigger than Coco Gauff. Those are not small names. Those are the biggest names in the sport. And a 20-year-old from the Philippines, who just 18 months ago was ranked 140th in the world, was outdrawing both of them. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to March 2025. Alex Eala arrived at the Miami Open as a wildcard entry. That means she did not earn her place in the draw through her ranking. She was given an invitation, a chance, an opportunity that most people expected her to use and then disappear. She had no seeding. She had no expectations placed on her. Most casual tennis fans had never heard her name. She was ranked so low that she was essentially invisible to the broader tennis conversation. Nobody was previewing her matches. Nobody was building content around her rise. She was, for all practical purposes, just another young player trying to make her mark on a tour that had seen thousands of young players try and fail to do the same thing. Then she walked onto the court and beat Madison Keys. Keys was no pushover. She was an experienced, powerful player who had proven herself at the highest levels of the game, but Eala handled her. Then came the match that made everyone take notice. She stepped across the net and faced Iga Świątek, the most dominant force in women's tennis, a player who had spent years at world #1 and built a reputation as one of the greatest of her generation. Eala beat her. A wild card ranked 140th knocked out the most dominant player in women's tennis. The tennis world blinked. Some called it a fluke. Some said it was a one-off upset that would not be repeated. But even the people calling it a fluke could not ignore what was happening in the stands. The crowds at Miami were unlike anything tournament staff had seen for those particular matches. Filipino flags filled entire sections of the stadium. Sections that had been half empty for other matches suddenly had no spare seats. Fans were standing. The energy in the arena felt less like a tennis match and more like a concert. People who were there said they had never experienced anything like it inside a tennis venue. The attendance numbers exceeded projections by a margin that surprised even the organizers. And this was not happening for a seeded player. This was not happening for a Grand Slam champion. This was happening for a wild card who was ranked 140th in the world at the start of the week. By the end of that week, she had reached the WTA 1000 semifinal. She became the first Filipino player in history to go that deep in a tournament of that size and importance. She had entered Miami on a Monday ranked 140th in the world. By Sunday, she was inside the top 100 and had a semifinal finish at one of the biggest tournaments on the calendar. The trajectory was not accidental. It was not luck. It was a pattern beginning to take shape, and anyone watching closely enough could see it forming in real time. The rest of 2025 continued the story. Eala kept competing, kept climbing, kept building. She traveled to Guadalajara and won her first WTA 125 title. That victory was important, not just because it added hardware to her career, but because it showed she could close.
She could get to the end of a week and finish the job. Her ranking kept moving in one direction, past 70, past 60, past 50. Each tournament brought more flags in the stands, more noise from the Filipino community around the world, and more evidence that what had started in Miami was not a one-week story. It was a sustained rise that was picking up speed rather than slowing down. Nike took notice. When a global brand of that size makes a decision about who to partner with, they are not making emotional choices. They are reading data. They are looking at who moves product, who generates engagement, who represents something larger than just their sport. Nike signed Alex Eala as a global ambassador. Then they did something that told the full story of what they believed about her future. They put her face on the walls of their Oregon headquarters. Portraits of Alex Eala, celebrating her heritage, her flag, her people, hanging in the hallways of one of the most powerful sports brands on the planet. That is not a standard endorsement deal. That is a statement about where they believe this story is going. Then came February 2026, and Dubai. If Miami had introduced Alex Eala to the world, Dubai was where she reminded everyone that the introduction was not a fluke. She drew Jasmine Paolini, the 8th seed, in a match that many expected to be competitive at minimum and potentially a loss for Eala. Instead, it was a demolition, 6-1 in the first set, a tiebreak to close in the second. Paolini, a top 8 player with experience and quality, was chasing shadows across the court. She could not get a foothold. She could not find a rhythm. Eala was simply better on that day, and not by a small margin. She dismantled a top 10 player in straight sets and made it look almost routine. The crowd in Dubai was enormous, standing room only sections, Filipino flags once again filling the venue. The same energy that had been building since Miami, now on an even bigger stage, in a different country, on a different continent, and the fans had followed. After the match, Eala stood on the court with a microphone in her hand and asked the crowd a question. She asked how many of them had prayed for her. The roar that came back was the answer. And when you understand that 115 million people in the Philippines were watching that moment, when you understand the weight of what it means to be the first of your nation to reach these heights, the significance of that question and that roar starts to make sense. On February 23, 2026, the WTA rankings updated. Alex Eala moved to world number 31. That number sounds like a statistic, but it was actually history. No Filipino woman had ever been ranked that high in the 47-year history of the WTA Tour. Every woman who had come before her, every Filipino player who had ever picked up a racket and dreamed about competing at the highest level, had never gotten to that number. Eala got there at 20 years old, and she got there in less than 2 years from being ranked 140th. When the Indian Wells draw was released, her name appeared with a seeding for the first time, seeded 31st at a WTA 1000 event. Another piece of history, another first for Filipino tennis, and the draw gave her a projected path that could bring her face-to-face with Coco Gauff as early as the 3rd round. The experts who had once scrolled past her name on tournament draws were now circling it, highlighting it, building articles and videos and podcast episodes around it. YouTube filled up with content breaking down her rise. Podcasts that had barely mentioned her 12 months ago were scrambling to explain how they had missed her. Tennis media had been forced to catch up with something that Filipino fans had already known for a long time. The stadium attendance data across Miami, Dubai, and Indian Wells told a consistent story. Eala was not just performing well on the court, she was filling seats in ways that exceeded what her ranking and seeding would normally generate. Tournament directors track this information carefully because a player who brings in crowds regardless of where she is seated represents a different kind of commercial value. Traditional tennis economics said you needed the Grand Slam titles first and the fan base would follow. Eala was flipping that completely. The fan base had arrived before the major trophies, the commercial power had built before the ranking peaks, and the sport's major tournaments were beginning to understand what that meant for scheduling, marketing, and the future of the women's game. Steve Johnson's declaration on the Nothing Major podcast carried extra weight because of who he is and how he said it. He did not hedge. He did not qualify his statement with language about potential or trajectory. He placed her ahead of Sabalenka and ahead of Gauff in terms of crowd drawing power, right now. Those are the 2 biggest names in women's tennis at this point in time. Sabalenka has been number 1 in the world. Gauff is an American Grand Slam champion with a massive following. And a former top 20 ATP player with 12 years of experience on tour looked at the data, looked at the crowds, and said Eala was drawing bigger. When someone with those credentials makes that statement without prompting, without context, without being asked a leading question, it means the evidence was so clear that it simply could not be ignored.
The pattern that Johnson was describing had been building across every event Eala played. The crowds arrived first, then the results followed. Then the media scrambled to explain what the fans had already figured out months earlier.
That sequence repeated itself at Miami. It repeated itself at Dubai. It was setting up to repeat itself at Indian Wells, and each time it repeated, the scale got larger. More flags, more fans, more noise, more media attention, more commercial interest, more history being made. The Dubai quarterfinal against Goff exposed the gap that still exists between Eala and the very top of the game. Goff won 6-0, 6-2. The scoreline left no room for a soft interpretation. Eala was outplayed comprehensively by a player who was operating at the absolute peak of the sport. In her post-match press conference, Eala did not make excuses. She did not look for silver linings that were not there. She acknowledged the gap directly. She said it was pretty prominent. Then she said something that told you everything about how she processes setbacks and what her mindset looks like going forward. She said she was on the right path. Two simple words that contained a complete philosophy. 14 days later, she arrived at Indian Wells with her first ever WTA 1000 seeding. The path she had referenced had already picked up exactly where she left off. What makes Eala's story different from other young players who have generated buzz is the combination of elements happening at the same time. The results are real. The ranking movement is genuine. The fan following is organic and massive and geographically dispersed. The commercial interest from a brand like Nike at a global ambassador level is significant. The historical records are being broken. The media attention is accelerating. These things do not usually all happen simultaneously. Normally, a player gets results first and the rest follows gradually. Eala built the fan following while the results were still developing, and now the results are catching up to the crowd that was already there waiting for them. The question that the Indian Wells tournament posed was whether Eala could translate everything she had built into a deep run at one of the biggest events on the calendar. She had been a semi-finalist at a WTA 1000 as a wild card. She had beaten top 10 players. She had won titles. She had climbed 50 places in the rankings across a single year. The Goff scoreline showed the distance to the very top still existed, but distance on a scoreline and distance in terms of trajectory are two different measurements. The scoreline showed where she was in February 2026. The trajectory showed where she was heading. The Filipino tennis community did not wait for rankings or experts or media verification before deciding what Alex Eala meant to them. They were in the stands at Miami when she was ranked 140th, and nobody outside the Philippines had heard her name. They were in the stands at Dubai when she beat a top 8 player in straight sets. They will be in the stands at Indian Wells and Roland Garros and every other tournament where she competes, because they recognized something before the establishment did. They saw the quality, the hunger, the competitive mentality, and the representative significance of what she was doing before any of it had been validated by rankings or titles or media coverage or brand partnerships. 115 million people watched that Dubai post-match moment when she asked the crowd how many had prayed for her. That number puts into perspective the scale of what is at stake every time she walks onto a court. She is not just competing for herself or for a ranking position or for prize money. She is carrying something much larger, and she has always seemed to understand that weight and use it as fuel rather than letting it become a burden. The way she carries that responsibility with gratitude and directness and emotional openness is part of why the connection between her and her fans is so strong. The spring swing of 2026 was set up to be the most important stretch of her career so far. Indian Wells first, then Miami's return 3 weeks later, then the clay court season through Madrid and Rome. Each event was another data point in a story that was accelerating. Each result was another chapter in something that the tennis establishment was still catching up to understand fully. The experts who had dismissed her Miami run as a fluke were watching her practice at Indian Wells alongside Sabalenka, two players on completely opposite ends of the credibility timeline, sharing the same court as equals in preparation, if not yet in ranking. Alex Eala has changed the formula for what tennis stardom looks like. She has shown that the fan army does not have to wait for the Grand Slam trophies. She has shown that commercial power can build before the ranking peaks arrive. She has shown that 115 million people watching from one country can fill stadiums on the other side of the world. And she has shown that a wild card ranked 140th can walk into a tournament, beat the best player in the world, and start a chain of events that rewrites the history of an entire nation's relationship with a sport. The experts who once overlooked her now have to explain how they missed the obvious. The fans who believed before belief was safe are watching every piece of what they predicted come true, one match at a time. Can she turn all of that belief into a deep Indian Wells run? Does the gap to Goff need to close further before the biggest moments arrive? The answers are coming, and they're coming fast. Drop your prediction in the comments below, and if you have been following this story since Miami, you already know that you were part of the group that saw it first. Subscribe now and stay with this story because it is only just reaching its peak, and the fans who believed early deserve to be there for every single moment of what comes next.